some officers from the City of Columbia Police Department. When we did this book, we wanted to bring police officers and sergeants in because we didn't want our kids to have to fear the police. We wanted to have some conversations. So they actually read the book too. And they came and we had some dialogues and some town halls so they could ask those officers questions, kind of make connections. So those officers are here too. So if you guys can wave, we have the best SRO, school resource officer, she's here. And so that's who's in the audience. And I'll be back. I'm gonna turn it over to Ms. McGill and Ms. Vanderhorst. We are ready.
Awesome.
Good morning, Ms. Thomas. How are you doing?
I'm okay. How are you?
Good. I just want to say thank you for first writing this book because it allowed us to touch a lot of those topics that people do not want to address with our students. And as Dr. Coltrane said, we made it a community involvement. But I will say that right now is the culminating activity that we've been waiting on for an entire year. So thank you. And we're all looking forward to your next book.
Thank you.
Good morning again, Ms. Thomas. I'm Ms. Vanderhorst, the 8th grade ELA teacher. And our students have several questions that they prepared to address different concepts of the book, from the writing process to some of the different concepts that were addressed in the book and just overall questions in general. So we're gonna let them go ahead, if you're prepared to do so, and present you with some of those questions for our discussion.
All right, sounds good.
What was the most difficult part writing the HBCUs?
The hardest part about writing the book was all of the research that had to be done for the book. I don't have like a legal background or a law enforcement background, but I had to research all of these things while writing the book, even though sometimes the book didn't go into a lot of that stuff. You know, I needed to know what a grand jury was myself. I needed to know how long that process could take. I needed to know what that process would entail for somebody like Star. So I had to do a lot of legal research. I spoke to attorneys. I spoke to district attorneys. I even spoke to law enforcement officers. And it was just making sure that I had enough knowledge so that even if I didn't include some of those details in the book, there were things that I needed to know so that it would still come off authentic. So I had to do all of that. And then I had to read a lot of court cases and stuff of real life situations like this. Like, for instance, I read all of the court documents from the Michael Brown case. I read all of the court documents from the Trayvon Martin case. But then, too, I read family accounts of these young men because so often when we look at the news and we see the media, we only see them presented as not even sometimes as victims, but just as names, as hashtags, and we don't see the real people. So I wanted to research the families and their frustrations and what does it mean for them when their loved one seems to be reduced to a hashtag. So I had to do stuff like that. So that was definitely the hardest part. The other hard part was just getting into the emotional mindset of it all and making sure that I wrote Star's emotional journey as authentic as possible. You know, she deals with unfortunately, she deals with a lot of mental health things that I don't really address like I wish I would have in the book. But it really takes a toll on her, not just emotionally, but mentally. And I had to research, you know, trauma like that and what that can mean for a person and how that can present itself. So it was stuff like that. That was definitely hard. And then writing it was hard in the sense of when Star was upset, I was upset. You know, when I wrote Khalil's death, it was hard for me, but the hardest part was really just Star's emotional journey throughout and her being in such a vulnerable place that was hard to write at times. So it was definitely a combination of the research and the emotional journey that made it a struggle at times to write.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How much say did you have doing the movie?
Mhm. I wasn't a decision maker on the movie, but I definitely was consulted a lot. I'm an executive producer on the movie, and so my opinions were greatly valued. I got a lot of say in. Well, I got to give my opinion on small things and large things. For instance, like the scene at the end with Sakani, that was run by me before they ever wrote it. And I approved it because I thought it was phenomenal, and I thought that was such a great way of visualizing the whole concept of thug life. And so when I was told about it, when they told me they wanted to do it and asked if I was okay with it, I was so okay with it that I wanted to change the book and put it in the book. But the book was out at the time, so it was too late for that. But I got I got the chance to give my opinion on smaller details, even like Star's bedroom and stuff like that. Like I spent 6 weeks on set, and when I was there, they wanted me to see her room and what it looked like, and just to give my approval. And when I went into her room, she had pictures of Chris on the wall. Now, y'all read the book, y'all know that Maverick doesn't know about Chris for like a big chunk of the book. And so I was like, there's no way her dad would see these pictures of this guy on her wall and wouldn't ask questions. So I was like, nah, that's got to come down. You know, Maverick is not a knock, may I come in kind of dad. He's I own this house. I'm going to walk in when I want to walk in. Who is this white boy on your wall? Why you got these pictures on your wall? What you mean you got a boyfriend? What? He's that kind of dad, you know, and no, that wouldn't have affected anything in the movie. That wouldn't have changed things. But I knew for me and for my readers that it was important that that wasn't there, because that would just take away from the whole idea of her keeping Chris a secret. So I did get some say on some things. My opinion was greatly valued, but I'm very happy with how the film turned out. It's not exactly like the book, and I was okay with that going in, because I understood that the book and the movie were going to be fraternal twins. They weren't going to be identical, and that's okay. But I think that they share so much of the same DNA that it's a beautifully done film. So I'm very happy with how it turned out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tyler. A lot of people want to ban the hate you give from being in public schools. What are your thoughts on that, and how does it affect you as a writer?
You know, it initially when it started happening, it bothered me because so many people would say, well, the language in the book, the language in the book. The thing is, let's just be honest for a second. One, you guys curse. I mean, let's be real. So when parents aren't looking, you say words. When adults aren't around, you say words that you shouldn't use, and that's just the truth. But the thing is, too, there are exactly 89 instances of the F word in the hate you give. But last year alone, over 800 people lost their lives at the hands of police brutality. That's the number we need to take far more seriously than those F-bombs in the book. So I wish that people would be more concerned about life and people's lives than they are about words. I wish that they had just as much outrage about Tamir Rice as they do about the F-bombs in my book, you know? So it bothers me when it happens, but I end up with a lot of hope every time it happens, because when it does, there's some young person who decides to speak up and speak out for the book and fight for the book. Like when it happened in Texas, a 15-year-old girl went before the school board and fought to get the book put back on shelves, and she won. And now she's an activist in her own right. So it's sad when it happens, but I also have come to recognize that the books that make people the most uncomfortable are the books that they probably need the most. And if I've made people uncomfortable, that's a good thing. I hope I continue to make them uncomfortable, because real change comes from discomfort.
My name is Wilhelmina Hunter. My question is, how did you feel about any of the hate comments that were given for the hate you give?
You know, I don't, a lot of that stuff doesn't get to me. Like literally, I don't see it, because I keep myself, I protect myself in a lot of ways where I don't see that stuff. Like I don't read reviews. I don't, my Twitter and my Instagram are very filtered, so I don't get a lot of stuff. So I've made a conscious decision to not even let that stuff get into my head or get in my vision. I don't even allow that stuff in, because for me, it's like, what's the point? I'm doing what I love, and I'm doing something that I care about and I have a passion for. And of course, people won't like that, but I just had to come to realize that I can't please everybody, and that's okay. So the hate comments, I'm sure there are some out there, and people are welcome to their own opinions, but I just have to keep focused on doing what I love and doing what I feel passionate about, and not worrying so much about what other people think and what they have to say. So when it's something that you love and that you're passionate about, you can't let people and their opinions get in the way of that. You can't let their opinions determine what you do or even how you continue to see yourself and what you do. You just have to keep doing what it is that you need to do and what you feel passionate about doing. So I say good luck to the haters. They're wasting their energy because it doesn't come across to me.
Hello, my name is Aria Brown. My question is, in order for a book to be good, what do you think is the most part of the book?
In order for a book to be good, what's the most important part?
Yes.
I think the most important part for a book to be good is the characters themselves. You have to have characters who feel real and who are whole and who are three-dimensional and not stereotypes and not flat. I think that a character has to feel like it's somebody that really exists. Even when it's a fantasy book, it has to feel like this person could really exist. Like, I look at like Harry Potter. I was a huge Harry Potter fan growing up, still am. But one thing I absolutely love was that Harry seemed so real, and all of the characters in his world seemed so real, even though some of them were like different kinds of things that you don't see in real life, like elves and stuff like that. But they still felt real and whole because J.K. Rowling did such a great job of making them so three-dimensional. They had hopes and dreams and aspirations, and they breathed on the page. So, you can really understand them and even see their motivations, even when you're not rooting for them. So I think that's the most important thing for a book to really be good, is that the characters themselves have to feel real and whole. And then the second most important thing, of course, is a well thought out plot. It would be nice to just have books where, for me as a writer, it'd be nice if I could just write books where my characters are doing absolutely nothing, and that would make me very lazy. But the fact is, something has to be happening in order to keep people's attention. So the plot is definitely important. But for me, I think the characters are a little more important than the plot, because if you don't care about the people, you won't care about the plot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kishana. Our teacher makes us create rough drafts of our writing. How many times did you have to make a rough draft?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Okay, so here's how my writing process goes. I always start with what I call my zero draft. And that's not the first draft, it's called zero draft. And my zero draft is where I write stuff just to get to know these characters, and I write them in scenes doing very small things just so I can figure out who they are. That has absolutely really nothing to do with the plot. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. I just need to know who they are, how they interact with one another, things like that. So like in my second book, I wrote scenes with the character and her family having dinner just so I could figure out how they would interact with one another. Then after I get that figured out, I work on my first draft. Then after I do that, because first draft is really just as bad as a zero draft, I work on my second draft. Honestly, for both of my books, I've done at least 7 drafts. And that's just work that I sometimes do myself. But now that I'm a published author, I work with an editor. And so with my editor, I do yet another round of edits, at least 2 or 3 rounds of edits with my editor. And then after we've gotten the book, the story, and the characters to where we want them to be, you have to do what's called copy edits, where somebody goes in who hasn't read the book and they go through every single line and make sure there are no grammar issues, no misspellings, things like that. And then you have what's called first pass pages after copy edits. And then you have second pass pages. And both of those are basically where they send you the book printed out on regular paper, and you have to go through with a pen or a pencil and mark through and make sure everything looks right. So altogether, there are at least 10 drafts of a book before it hits shelves, at least. I know with my second book, I have at least 15 drafts. So if your teachers have you guys doing a lot of different drafts, just remember that for a book to get done, it takes at least sometimes 10 drafts just to get it from the first time you sit down to write it until it's ready to go on a shelf. So I guess my note to the teachers is keep telling them to keep doing those drafts. And and for y'all though, but what I would say to y'all too is just know that all of your favorite authors do that, you know, and it's hard and it can be annoying at times because you're like, oh, am I done yet? I'm just ready to be done. But I promise in the end it's worth it. So just keep going, keep hanging in there. The best writers are great editors.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I heard a lot of applause from the teachers on that.
Hello, my name is Diana Hopkins, and my question is, was the Hate You Give immediately published or was it rejected at any time?
You know, with the Hate You Give, my journey was pretty much a fairy tale in the sense that I didn't get rejections for it. But I did have a book before the Hate You Give. It never came out. It's not published or anything. But I sent it to literary agents, and it was rejected over 200 times. So I have friends who've been rejected 300, 400, 500 times. So that's just honestly a part of it. I was lucky in the sense that with the Hate You Give, I first talked to my literary agent on Twitter about it. He wasn't my agent yet, but I first talked to a literary agent on Twitter about it. And he liked the idea and asked me to send it to him. And he loved it so much that he signed me. So I didn't deal with rejection a lot in that sense. It was really from the beginning it was really accepted by a lot of people. So that was surprising to me because that doesn't happen. But I've definitely dealt with rejection in the past. And it's just unfortunately a normal part of the process. And what I always say is it doesn't matter how many no's you get. All it takes is one yes to change everything. So always keep going for that one yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm the School Research Officer. My name is Officer Ken. How are you doing?
Hi.
All
Okay, how are you?
The question that I have to ask you is that you were stating that you did research with different law enforcement agencies. Am I correct? Now, what was one thing that you carried away from talking with the different law enforcement agencies?
You know, one thing that will always stay with me, specifically when I was writing Carlos. Carlos is based on a cousin of mine who was a cop. He was a well-known cop here in Mississippi, here in Jackson. And he was the one who actually had the talk with me at the beginning of the book. And one thing that I got from him and even from specifically other Black officers, was this struggle of, well, inside of the uniform, some people see me as a sellout. Outside of the uniform, some people still see me as a suspect. Nobody talks about that. And so that's something that's honestly stayed with me since writing the book. That was one of the biggest things that has really resonated with me, the struggle that so many of them have, so many of you have. And so it was something that I wanted to show even through Carlos of his struggle of having to be two different people in two different worlds. What's it like for him having to be Uncle Carlos and then Carlos the cop? You know, his struggle with Maverick and just his struggle in talking to Star about this whole situation. What does that mean for him on an emotional standpoint? So it gave me a lot of insight into the mindsets of Black officers and what they deal with specifically when it comes to so many of these cases of police brutality. And it was really eye-opening for me. And what it also showed me was, too, what I came to learn was more officers are more specifically, more Black officers are speaking up in favor of accountability. Like my cousin, that's a huge thing for him. He wanted to hold all his fellow officers accountable because he recognized the responsibility of what it meant to be in his position, but he also understood the danger of being in his position. But he never wanted to abuse his power, and he wanted those who did abuse their power to be brought to be held accountable. So it was a really eye-opening experience in the sense of getting to know what it means to be a Black officer and that struggle for them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shamari, and were you pleased with the screenwriting of the HBCU for the movie?
What was that?
I said, were you pleased with the screenwriting for the HBCU for the movie?
Was I pleased with it? Yeah, I was. I got to work on the script some myself a little bit and make tweaks here and there. I got to work with, we had 2 screenwriters, and I got to work with them both throughout the process. And they both asked me questions the entire time, and just they were really dedicated to getting it right and getting it as true to the book as possible. You know, they knew going in that they couldn't get everything from the book into the movie and into the script, and we just came to accept that. But they wanted to get as much of Star's story specifically in there as possible. We wanted the focus to be on Star and her journey and what it meant for her to go from being afraid to speak up to speaking up and speaking out. So that I was pleased with the process and how things went. Unfortunately, one of the screenwriters passed right before the movie came out, but she did get to see the movie. And I got to tell her thank you for the amazing work she did. But I'm very thankful because a lot of times the authors aren't involved in the process at all, but I was very involved in it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Taylor. As we read the book, The Hate You Give, what message from the novel did you have in mind for the reader?
Mm-hmm. I hoped that by the end of the book, the reader would understand that their voices matter and that they can use it to speak up and speak out and cause change. And that we all have the ability to change the world, and we can do that by starting to change the world around us. That's what Star comes to realize. But I really hope that my readers understood the importance of speaking up and speaking out and using your voice. Silence helps nobody. Silence gets us nowhere. So I hope that by the end, people understand that they have a voice and that they need to use it, whether they're 16 like Star or whether they're 60. You know, it's just important to speak up and speak out and be heard. So I hope that too. And I also hope that the book helps more people understand why we say that Black lives matter. We're not saying that all lives don't matter, but we're saying that we have a systemic problem in this country where Black lives don't matter enough. So Black lives matter too. So I hope that people walk away with a better understanding of that and why we say that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Devante, and my question is, what was the hardest scene to write in the HBCU?
The hardest scene to write, you know, a lot of people would assume that it was the shooting, but it actually wasn't. The hardest scene was Khalil's funeral. You know, when I wrote that scene, I had to think about the hardest day in my life, and that was the day of my grandmother's funeral. Not the day she passed, but her funeral. There's something so final about funerals, you know. In the days leading up to it, yeah, you're mourning the person and the fact that they passed, but the day of the funeral, this is it. You won't see them again. You won't, you know, there's no going back from that. And there's just something so final about putting someone in the ground and watching them get covered with dirt. There's something so final about it. So that was the hardest thing to write. Star really getting to that point of realizing this is it. This is the end. There's no coming back. I won't see Khalil anymore. He's in a coffin, and then that coffin is going to be lowered into the ground. You know, so that was definitely, I think, for me, the hardest part to write. And I had to go back to my own emotional state and mindset of when I lost my grandmother and her funeral, and how did I get through that when I was writing that scene. So definitely that's the one I think that was the biggest struggle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What skills do you need to become a writer?
What skills do you need to become a writer? The most important thing to do if you want to become a writer is read. And I know that seems kind of weird. You know, I'd say that's more important than anything. You have to read if you want to write. The best way to learn how to write is to read. And what I mean by that is read other books, read books in the type of, that talk about the type of things that you want to talk about, the genre that you want to write in. Read those kinds of books, and then you will really learn how to write those kinds of books. So I would say that's definitely the most important thing. And I'd say the second most important thing, specifically if you want to write fiction, is to get a good understanding of people, and how they interact with one another, and how they speak with one another, and just how they communicate, and how they process their emotions and stuff like that. You know, you have to sometimes just look at yourself even. That's a good starting place of what would I do in a situation like this? How would I react in a situation like this? And you can use that as a good starting point to writing characters. So I would say paying attention to people and the way they communicate with one another is important. But then there's just understanding, honestly, just the fundamentals of grammar and language and things like that. Just having a good grip of that goes a long way. So a good way to get a good grip of that goes back to rule number 1, read. So the most important thing to do to become a writer, read, read, read.
Were there any ideas or real life actions that helped you with the HBS?
Yeah, there were. You know, when I wrote the book, I first wrote it as a short story when I was in college. And I got the idea from some things I was dealing with myself in a real life case at the time. I was in college and I went to a mostly white private upper class school, and I lived in a mostly black poor neighborhood, and I often found myself being two different people in two different worlds. And while I was in school, a young man named Oscar Grant lost his life in Oakland, California at the hands of police brutality. I didn't know Oscar personally, but I took his death very personally. But so many of my classmates, specifically my white, rich classmates, didn't care, didn't understand. They just weren't even talking about it. And so some of them even tried to explain why it was okay that he lost his life the way he did, because he was an ex-con. So in my anger and frustration, I had to do something. So I decided to write, and that's where I initially got the idea from. So many of the other things in the book are inspired by things from my own life, and people that I know. So many of the characters in the neighborhood are inspired by people that I actually know. So many of the locations even in the neighborhood are inspired by actual places here in Mississippi. So for me, I did take a lot of things from real life and put them into the book in a fictionalized way. But I think, honestly, a lot of writers, we tend to do that. Like, if there's ever somebody I don't like, they could be pretty sure that they're going to end up in my book in some way. So, but yeah, I mean, like for my second book, the people that came at the Hate You Give, and really tried to get it banned and stuff, there is a character in my new book on the come up that is definitely inspired by all of them. So I'm sure they will love it. But it's just, sometimes that's just what I have to do to help myself process things, just take inspiration from real life situations and put them into my stories. But for me, it's always the most important thing too is, like, for instance, with Oscar Grant, although I was inspired, motivated by his passing to write this story, I did not want to write Khalil's story as if it was Oscar's story, because Oscar's story is not my story to tell. Trayvon's story is not my story to tell. But I was motivated by the reactions to their deaths when I wrote that book. So I would never say that this story or my stories are anyone else's stories. But I will say that sometimes I'm inspired or motivated by those things when I write.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ayana Nelson. So the hate you give is very realistic. What did you have to cut? What did you have to edit or cut out so that it wouldn't be too controversial?
Well, I was lucky in the sense that I was never made to feel as if I had to cut anything because of controversy. My editor and my agent both were all about making sure the story was authentic as possible, and they never wanted to water it down. They never made me feel like I was going too far with anything. Anything that was cut, it was cut for story's sake, or for character's sake, and not for because it would be too controversial. For instance, there was a scene originally in The Hate U Give where Star gets revenge on Haley. And when I say revenge, I mean it was pretty freaking brutal. First, I have to say that Haley did something pretty awful to Star. Originally, like, Haley wrote the N-word on Star's locker and some stuff like that. And Star was going to get her back in a very kind of brutal way. And when I turned that in to my editor, she said, we don't need this. And it wasn't so much because it would cause controversy. It was because, for one, she said, the type of racism we see from Haley, it would be a pretty big jump for her to go from the type of racism that we see from her to outright using that word, which, yeah, I have to agree with that. Yeah, she's awful, but she's not stupid. She's not stupid enough to use that word. But two, like she pointed out to me, Star getting revenge on her wasn't necessary. It would take away from Star's character in a sense, and who she is and who her parents have raised her to be, to do something as brutal as what she originally was going to do. So it wasn't necessary. And honestly, Star deciding to no longer have anything to do with Haley was the best revenge possible, was the best way to make a statement, and was the best way to show this character remaining in character and doing something that is really true to herself, and that's simply walking away from Haley. So it wasn't needed. So I never felt like, though, it was because it was too controversial. It's just sometimes things just don't fall in line with what's necessary for the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, good morning. I'm Sheree Hunter. The question I have is, in the book, the family moves out of Garden Heights into a bigger, nicer home. In the movie, they stay in the community. What is your take on this from the writer's perspective, and what are your thoughts on this for parents who move out to give their kids better opportunities in a way of life?
When they told me that they were going, because originally in the movie they were going to move, but when they did some test screenings with audiences were like, they're so committed to the neighborhood. Why would they leave? It doesn't seem right that they leave. And so the film studio came to me and they were like, well, is it okay if we change it? And I had to sit and think about it. And honestly, I could see them going either way. I could see them staying. I could see them moving. I could see them even later on deciding to move. Just because they stay right now, in the movie doesn't mean that they stay forever. But I understood why people would say, it seems weird that they leave in the movie. But in the book, because there's so much more set up for it, it seems right that they leave. So I could see it going either way. But I think that they both, in the movie and in the book, that struggle of do we stay or do we leave is so real. It's something I dealt with myself recently. I recently moved out of my neighborhood. It's been about a year now, and I moved to the suburbs, and I had that struggle of, does this make me a sellout? Does leaving my old neighborhood change, who I am? Does this mean I'm somebody I'm not who I thought I was? What does this say about me? But I had to come to the understanding for myself personally that just because I don't live there doesn't mean I don't still care about it, and doesn't mean I'm not going to make an investment in that community. And that's something I'm dedicated to doing, making an investment in that community, even if I don't live there. So I think, though, for a lot of parents, it comes down to a personal decision. And I think in the case of Star's parents, it comes down to what is most important for our children, our family. In the book, it felt like the most important thing was because we see a little more of the danger of them staying. It was important for them to leave. In the movie, yeah, we saw some of that, but in the movie, we saw also that King was arrested and that threat was no longer, there. So they felt a little more comfortable about leaving. So about staying. So I think it could have, honestly, it works both ways to me. But in my head, they're always going to leave. Always going to leave. And that doesn't take away from what they think about the community or their dedication to the community. I think it would mean more so that it would be a great way for Maverick as a person to grow and realize that where you live does not define who you are. You define who you are no matter where you live.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alvin Allen. While watching the movie, it was a quote or a saying that y'all made during the movie. It said, "We will never be unarmed because the weapon that they fear is our blackness." And I wrote it down because it meant so much. Could you tell me what's behind that quote, or how do you feel pertaining to that quote?
That is an actual quote from an activist by the name of Shamel Bell. Shamel Bell has been associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, and she's just an amazing activist out of Los Angeles. And she also happens to be our director's god sister. And so she was a real big consultant on the film. She helped us with a lot of stuff. She's actually in the movie. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but during the protests at the end, when they're marching towards City Hall, there's a little boy at the very front of the crowd. Well, he has long hair, and some people think it's a girl. But there's a little boy at the front of the crowd leading the protest, and that's actually Shamel's son. So she worked with us so much on the movie and stuff that we wanted to include that quote from her because it is so powerful. And honestly, it reveals so much about where we are as where so much of this comes from. Racial bias is the leading cause of so many of these cases and so many of these situations. And why is that? Because Blackness is so feared. And Blackness is so often seen as a threat. I look at news stories, and when I'm just going to say it, when recently there was a news story where this white man killed his entire family. And did they show his mugshot on the news? No. What did they show? Him with his wife and children and their golden retriever smiling at the camera. But I also saw a case recently here in Mississippi where a Black man was a victim of a crime. And what did they do? Even though he was the victim, they showed his mugshot. So it goes to this whole idea of Black people being shown as threats, even when we're the victims. That's what I think when we say our Blackness is a weapon. That's what I think about. That's what I immediately think about, how so often we're perceived as threats, even when we're victims, how so often our deaths are justified because we had to have been doing something wrong. I look at Trayvon Martin. When Trayvon Martin died, people were talking about his school record more than they were talking about what George Zimmerman did. Why? Because as a young Black male, something had to be wrong with him, is the message that they were putting out there. There had to be a reason that he was responsible for his death. So when I think about people saying Blackness is being seen as a weapon, when I think about that phrase, I think about that. And I think about the threatening, the way that we're perceived as threats so often. So it was a powerful quote, and I think it really digs into so much of the message of the movie. And even when Star has that conversation with Carlos in the movie, and he tells her what he would have done if it was a white man versus a Black person, that goes right back to that quote of Blackness being seen as a threat, Blackness being seen as something wrong, because he recognizes and he has to admit that in that situation, he would have probably made the wrong assumption about the Black person as opposed to the white person. So it explains a lot of what's happening in our society right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I had another question. In the book, we got to know a character named Devante, but in the movie, Devante was not in the movie.
Can you explain to us what happened to Devante? Or
Yeah. When they first told me that they were gonna cut Devante from the movie, I can't lie, my first reaction was, what? No, you know. But they explained why. If you watch the movie, I have to tell you guys, the movie comes out tomorrow on iTunes and at home streaming tomorrow. So definitely be on the lookout for that. You can buy it on iTunes, and the DVD comes out and the Blu-ray comes out January 22nd. But if you watch the movie again, I want you to notice something. The camera is always either on Star or it's from Star's perspective, the entire movie. I would say there's only maybe about 10, 15 seconds in the whole film where it's not on Star. And that was done deliberately. They wanted the movie to be about her 100%, and they felt like including Devante and his story would have taken away from Star, because we couldn't have just thrown him in there. We would have had to shown him and who he was and how he got to the position he was in, and that would have taken away from Star. So when they told me, I understood 100%. And honestly, had they just thrown him in, it wouldn't have done his character any justice at all, and it would have just been he just would have been there just to be there, and that wouldn't have done him any justice. So once they explained the why, I was okay with it. And I have to admit, and I'm gonna sound like a bad parent, I watched the movie 3 times before I realized he wasn't in it. I am such a bad parent. That's like going to the grocery store and then coming home and realizing you left your kid at the store a couple of days later. Like, I feel like a bad parent. But here's what I tell everybody. Don't worry. Devante and Nana are all right. They're on a poker playing tour of the United States, and they're making good bank. They're good. You know, Devante didn't need to be in the movie because it was just going to make his head get big, and he'd be like, I'm famous. Y'all can't tell me nothing. And Nana wouldn't have wanted all those people in her business, no way. So they're good. It's all right. I promise. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Barry. Would you ever make a sequel to The Hate You Give?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's funny because I get asked that quite a bit, and I talked about that on Twitter recently. I don't see myself writing a sequel right now because I'd have to put Star through too much, and I feel like at this point, Star is like, Angie, please leave me alone. You know, I think Baby Girl needs a rest from me, because the truth is, you know, I'd have to put her through some kind of trauma in order for a sequel to happen. And I think at this point she just needs to live her life without Angie meddling in it, you know. But right now I'm actually in the early stages of writing a prequel, and it is about Maverick when he was a teenager. And so I'm very excited about that book. I'm in the very early stages of writing it. It hasn't even been announced, but it's going to be fun, and it's going to be about, you know, his life, what it meant for him to become a father of 2 children at such a young age. And I hope that it gives people insight on teen parenthood and the struggle of that. And I hope that in some ways it helps bring down some numbers on teen parenthood, you know. But I really want to show how does he go from being a shoot first, ask questions later guy to the father that we see in The Hate You Give. So I'm really excited about that. So no plans for a sequel, but I am working on the prequel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When you wrote The Hate You Give, did you have a particular plot plan?
You know, I did. I always knew going in that it was going to be about Star dealing with the shooting death of her best friend. And what I did early on was I wrote out a 10-sentence summary of it. I think if you can write out 10 short sentences about a book and what's going to happen, you've got a good idea of what you should do with your plot. I think that's one of the best ways to start working on a book, is to at least write 10 sentences about what it's going to be about, and that will help you going in. That's kind of your little mini roadmap. So I always knew it was going to be about that, but so much of the other stuff developed along the way, like Devante's story developed along the way. Star and Kenya's friendship and relationship developed along the way, because initially they were not friends. They were the opposite of friends initially, but as I was writing them, I was like, why not have these two Black girls, even despite their differences, find some common ground and find friendship with one another? Let's see more of that. So that was something that developed along the way. So I allow myself to stick to the big picture plot ideas, but I never make myself stick with the smaller details or the smaller plot things, because I think it's important to let characters become so real that you come to realize that there are things they would and would not do and would not say, and you should allow yourself the freedom to change that along the way. So I never stick with the small stuff, but I always stick with the big picture. So I always knew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Eleanor Dalton, and I have a statement more than a question.
Okay.
But I noticed your Hillman sweatshirt.
Yes.
And would you please just tell our students that you wouldn't be who you are today if it wasn't for Hillman or HBCU? And as a graduate of a HBCU, North Carolina A&T, we need, yes, we need our HBCUs. Good things come from our HBCUs. Good people come from our HBCUs. So if you would just talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to sound like a hypocrite, though, because I didn't go to a HBCU. I went to like the opposite one. I'm sorry. I went to a mostly white upper class private school here in Mississippi. But the thing is, though, if I hadn't gone there, I wouldn't have written The Hate You Give the way I did, because my struggle of being two different people in those two worlds really inspired me as I was writing the book. But had I gone to an HBCU, I wouldn't have had that struggle. And I think it's important that we keep these schools open and that we encourage students to attend them. HBCUs are extremely important. Hillman was from a show called A Different World. I don't know if you guys know about that. But Hillman, honestly, Hillman is the reason I went to college, and I think so many other young people went to college, because it showed people like us in school. It showed us in college. It showed us pursuing higher education, and that was something that so many of us needed. So both of my parents went to an HBCU, Jackson State, and I felt like I betrayed the family when I didn't go to one. But I think it's extremely important, and I hate that so often people write them off as like, oh, that's just the Black school. You're not gonna get a good education there. Yes, you will, and not only will you get a good education there, but you will walk away with a better understanding of yourself, and not just that, but who you are, but not just who you are, but who you can be. I think that's what HBCUs do beautifully. They show you one of the best mirrors possible when you go on those campuses. So I definitely encourage it, even though I didn't do it myself. I should have done it, but I definitely encourage it.
I have another question. In the book, what gave you the idea to write about Star's grandmother and her backstory with her mother and uncle?
Mm-hmm. Nana is one of those characters that was fun to write, but I also didn't want to just make her the comedic part of the book. I wanted to really have a real person, and so often, with people like her. With a character like her, it would be just easy to laugh at some of the things she says, and then you wonder, why does she say the things she says? Why does she act the way that she acts at times? What's her story? So I get to go into that a little more actually with my third book, The Maverick People, that I'm working on now, because so much story intertwined with Lisa's story, and so much of Lisa's story is about her mom and her struggle of dealing with a mom who's an alcoholic. So it was important for me, and it's important for me to explore that in the new book. We lost him. Yeah.
She's still there.
She's still there.
No, she not talking. Can she
She might be able to hear.
say something? Go again. Say, can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
There she is.
There you go.
Huh?
I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. I'm so sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, it was important for me to show someone like Lisa coming from a mom like that who has so many issues, because I hope that it would show young people who maybe do have parents like Nana, who may have some sort of addiction, who may at times be hard to deal with, that you can still come through that and come through it stronger and come through it a better person in the end, and you can learn from their mistakes and decide to not repeat them. So it was important for me to show that through that character, and I'm excited to get to explore more of her story even through Maverick's story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I had a question. Sometimes in movies we see actors and actresses go from a role in comedy to something that's more serious. With your writing, do you see yourself traveling outside of the current genre to something different? Or are you just gonna kind of stay with what's been working or what appears to be working just fine?
You know, I plan to explore different things. You know, I'm currently in the very early stages of working on a TV project. You know, I can't talk about it, but it's definitely different from The Hate You Give. And then I plan on writing for younger readers. I plan on writing a fantasy novel for younger readers around about a 12-year-old character. So I'm definitely not going to just stick with one thing. I think it's important for me as an author to explore different things, but I also think it's important for readers to see, because I'm going to write about Black people. I'm just going to be honest. I'm probably going to always write about Black people. And it's important for people to see Black people in different kind of scenarios and different kind of situations. You know, through Black Panther, we got to see Black people as superheroes. So let's see more of that, you know. Let's see more Black girls who are dealing with college stuff and being carefree and stuff like that. Let's see more of that. So I want to touch on different things and never box myself into one type of story or even one type of format. So I'm definitely excited for all of the things that I have lined up and things that I'm working on, because I do get to explore different types of characters dealing with different types of situations beyond just police brutality, beyond poverty, beyond this and that. So I will never, ever just box myself in, but I will never say that there's something I wouldn't write again. Would I write another story about that, like The Hate You Give, dealing with something like that? Possibly, but it's going to take a while because that one was hard. So, you know, like with my second book, I get to deal with the early criminalization of Black girls and freedom of speech and hip hop. I was really excited about that. But, you know, those are still things, issues in a sense, but it's different. So I get to explore different types of issues, I hope. And I hope that people never expect one type of thing from me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's me again. I always do that. It's a habit. Quick question. You mentioned the word controversy a lot, like at least 2 or 3 times. The relationship between Star and Chris, how did you come about that relationship? Is that something that you experienced or something that you've seen?
Mm-hmm. Look at you trying to get in my business. Okay, I will say this. It's all right. It's all good.
Nobody asked that. That was the subject that I didn't see anybody touch on yet, and I was like, "Oh, yeah." Talk about the relationship between Star and Chris. So I figured I'd be the one that, you know, that's my job. I get paid to be nosy.
Nah, that's all right. I'm not mad. I will say yes. Chris is based on a real person, and yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. But with that relationship, you know, I wanted to show through Star and Chris, you know, like really the struggle of being in an interracial relationship, and not just being in an interracial relationship, but being in one when you're dealing with something so racially charged. What does that mean? What kind of conversations do you have? And through the character of Chris, I also wanted to show this young man who has so much privilege, how his journey is shaped by the things that he sees through Star. And how does he come to an understanding and being a better ally? I will say this, Chris is not woke. Chris is not woke. Chris is not woke at all. Matter of fact, Chris is like drowsy. Chris was in a coma at the beginning of the book, and he was in a coma at the beginning of the book, basically. And by the end, he's still not woke. He's drowsy. He still has a long way to go. But if a young man like him can get to a point of being even a little bit more woke, I have a little hope for other people full of privilege. But the key thing that Chris does to even get a little woke is he listens. And that's really what I wanted to show through him, through that character, and through their relationship. So often there's this word that gets thrown around a lot, ally, when it comes to social justice, and people call themselves allies in so many of these situations, but they don't do the key thing, and that is listen. We need more people who listen. And then eventually I would hope that Chris would get on the front line alongside Star and fight with her, and use his privilege to the benefit of her if he ever had to use it. So through that character, I want to show that. But I also want to show that, and this is going to sound so corny, but these two kids who, despite this situation and these circumstances and despite their differences, they still love each other in the end. So if they can love each other, maybe, just maybe, love is a little more powerful than we think it is. So that's really what I wanted to show through that relationship.
Hi, also our speaker. My question is, who is Angie Thomas other than the author of a book?
That's a good question. Angie Thomas is a dreamer. Angie Thomas still has so much that she wants to accomplish. Angie Thomas is a Pelicans fan. I'm a big Pelicans fan. Well, an NBA fan, a LeBron James fan. I'm so sad that he is injured right now. I wish somebody would donate a growing to LeBron James so he can get back out there and play. Angie Thomas is a daughter. She is a Mississippian. I'm very outspoken about this state, and I understand that there are so many misconceptions about Mississippi and what's here and what people here are like. And I'm very dedicated to not just changing those perceptions, but changing things down here. So that's a big part of who I am too. Let's see. I'm a video gamer. My PlayStation 4 takes up too much of my time. I'm on NBA 2K19 right now. I'm a 90 overall for all the people who pay attention to that. Let's see. And Angie Thomas is a creative. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about stories, that I don't think about situations that I could do in some type of plot or characters. There's not a day that goes by that some character isn't in my head. So I'm definitely a creative, and Angie Thomas is not finished yet. Angie Thomas is going to do a whole lot more.
All right, thank you. On behalf of WFA Middle School, we really thank you. Can you guys give us?
And look, and thank y'all for dealing with my less than black girl magic. I'm about to head to the beauty shop right now. So I'm like, oh Lord, let me throw this head on my head. I'm heading straight to the beauty shop.
I have one question. We are a newly project-lit site, and so on the come up is our March read. So we're excited about that. Can you just introduce them briefly to Bree?
Yeah, sure.
Come if you want to. If you want to come to, okay.
I got you. On the come up is about 16-year-old Brianna, who wants to be one of the greatest rappers of all time, or at least get some people to listen to her. And her life is turned upside down when her mom unexpectedly loses her job, And 2, a song she makes goes viral for all the wrong reasons, and she finds herself in the center of a controversy that's too big for her to control. But as her family situation gets worse, she finds herself desperate to make it, even if it means becoming the very thing people have made her out to be. So it's a story for fighting for your dreams, even when all the odds are stacked against you. It's a story of hip hop, and it's a story of what it means to be a young Black person in America when freedom of speech isn't necessarily free. So I'm very excited about it.
Good, and we're excited about it. We're going to do it in March. So if you ever want to join us, we're going to do it in March. So as this segment, we're truly happy. We want to do one thing before we part. We'd like to be able to get our kids right down on this bottom row here together, and we're going to get a group shot, if that's okay. Yeah. Listen, I was thinking it in my head, and then Miss McGill said it. I was really thinking it in my head. Oh, are you okay with the shot, or you don't want, because of the direct, Miss Thomas, what you think?
Yes.
You okay? Sure. Kneel down. You gotta kneel down. Everybody gotta kneel down. Can I move this?
Oh, not too much.
I need a couple of y'all stand right here. A couple of y'all can stand. India.
She said, move over. Y'all want to sit down on the front, so y'all got to sit like how she sitting.
Trend. Arrow on the board so it goes down. Yeah, y'all just
go right here, kneel down. Oh, kneel. Right there. There you go. Here, you come here. There you go. I moved it.
We in? Everybody in? Eagles, no, the hate you give on 3. 1, 2, 3. The hate you give. Are we good? We good? Hold on. Look this way, this camera. Yeah, on 3, thug life.
Y'all didn't even say 1, 2, 3.
Y'all didn't even say 1, 2, 3. We good? All right, let's go. Thank you. Okay, y'all. I don't even know where we are. She's all popping.